Hey guys, tonight we take a journey into a world that's equal parts bizarre, hilarious, and surprisingly insightful medieval illuminated manuscripts. Yes, you heard that right. The ancient knights we've all read about, clad in armour, gallantly charging into battle fought, Snails well. Not exactly in the way you might think, but there are knights squaring off against snails in these very old, very quirky books. And that's just the beginning. Imagine this, you're curled up in the comfort of your home, dimming the lights after a long, exhausting day. The soft hum of a fan fills the air, and you grab a warm drink to sip on. You lean back, ready to binge read some ancient history, or maybe you're diving into those classic Arthurian tales. You know, knights, dragons, quest stuff that's supposed to get your blood pumping, but instead, you find yourself staring at a knight, not slaying dragons, not riding into battle, but fighting a snail. Yes, a snail. And before you say it, no, this is not a typo. You're not imagining things. There's a medieval knight in full armour, sword in hand, preparing for an epic showdown with a creature most of us would mistake for a slow-moving garden pest. What exactly is going on here? Why? In the midst of depicting epic sagas, would scribes waste precious ink and time drawing knights dueling with snails? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment to let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is on your side of the world. It's always interesting to see where everyone is joining in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with a little history. You see, illuminated manuscripts were a huge part of medieval culture. These handwritten, meticulously decorated books weren't just for reading, they were works of art, but despite their grand purpose, they didn't always feature the noble and highbrow subjects you'd expect from such masterpieces. Oh no, amid the biblical texts, the saintly stories and the epic sagas, you'd occasionally find something much more peculiar. Why the snails? Though historians still debate this one. But here's the thing, the answer might be a lot deeper than you think. These manuscripts, often adorned with vibrant borders and curious illustrations, were the work of monks, scribes, and artists who had a lot of free time, probably too much on their hands. Their jobs were to transcribe holy texts and important documents, but, well, sometimes they got a little creative. The snails weren't just doodles. Oh no. They were part of a much larger medieval commentary, often hidden in the margins of these books. The margins, those little spaces left around the main text, became a place for the scribe's imagination to roam free. There were no rules in the margins, if you were a medieval scribe. The margins were your personal playground for all things weird and whimsical. So, let's dive a little deeper into this snail thing. Back in the medieval period, people weren't quite as concerned with things like entertainment, social media, or Netflix. No, they had to find their distractions elsewhere. And it turns out, snails made for some pretty prime targets for medieval artists and scribes. But what's the deal with knights and snails? You'd think that knights, those brave, valiant protectors of the realm, would be fighting something a little more dangerous. Right, something with sharp claws, maybe, or even dragons, but no. Instead, they're up against creatures that carry their homes on their backs and move at a pace so slow. It's honestly almost comical. Now there's a lot more to this than just being a funny oddity. One scholar, Lillian Randall, dedicated a chunk of her career to understanding these peculiar illustrations. And, surprise, surprise, she actually discovered a pretty fascinating connection between these snails and the Lombards, a group of Germanic warriors. You see, Randall argued that these snail illustrations weren't just some random whimsy, they were a very pointed metaphor. The Lombards had invaded Italy And while they were initially feared, they soon became known as pawnbrokers, lenders, and wait for it, snail-like characters. Why? Oh well, the snails were slow, they carried their homes on their backs, and the Lombards they retreated after a major loss to Charlemagne in 722, and their reputation never really recovered. Imagine the medieval mindset, the idea of an enemy retreating with their homes on their backs, and taking their time doing so. Now, throw in the fact that the Lombards were also seen as greedy, cowardly, and generally unsavoury, and you've got a pretty perfect match for a snail. In these illuminated manuscripts, the snails weren't just an innocent addition, they were social commentary. They were a way for scribes to subtly criticise the Lombards, who had become a byword for laziness and opportunism in medieval Europe. The slow-moving creatures became a way of saying, hey, these people are as useless as snails. But not all historians agree with Randall. Some argue that the snails weren't a comment on the Lombards at all. Historians still argue whether the snails were a direct insult, or whether they were just an artist's silly doodle. A simple diversion from the more serious themes of medieval art. After all, not everything in those margins can be read as deeply symbolic, right? Maybe the snails were just snails. Whatever the true reason for the snails, they continue to provide us with a delightful peek into medieval humour. The medieval world wasn't all knights charging into battle and damsels in distress. No, sometimes it was about finding joy in the bizarre, like the absurdity of a knight fighting a snail. But there's more to these manuscripts than just snails and knights. These oddball images weren't isolated to just one or two scribes' sense of humour. No, the snails showed up in more than 70 illustrations across 30 different manuscripts, all made during a roughly 20-year period. It wasn't just one scribe doodling in his spare time. This was something of a cultural trend. These images, these fantastical and often absurd battles, became a norm in the way medieval scribes communicated with each other. And it's not just snails, oh no. There were rabbits, monkeys, and all sorts of bizarre creatures to keep the medieval mind entertained. What's also curious is that, despite their ridiculous nature, these marginal images weren't meant to be just funny. They were there to subtly poke fun at the world of politics, war, and power. Yes. The medieval world was a place of serious battles and dark moments, but in the margins of the books, the scribes found a way to express their own frustrations and humour. And honestly, they had every reason to laugh. Life in medieval Europe was tough. It was a time of disease, war, and a general sense of doom and gloom. But in the margins, they got to say, you know what? Let's draw a knight battling a snail. It was their way of making light of the heaviness of life. And who can blame them? This brings us back to those illuminated manuscripts, those detailed, painstakingly crafted books that were more than just religious texts. They were works of art that allowed people to express themselves in ways that history would otherwise forget. And those snails, they were part of that expression. A strange, humorous part of it. Yes, but a part nonetheless. So, next time you're flipping through the pages of an illuminated manuscript, or maybe just imagining one on a lazy afternoon, remember that sometimes history doesn't have to be all serious. Sometimes. It's about knights fighting snails, and honestly, that's just the kind of weirdness that makes history fun. But why snails? Well, that's a question we'll keep tackling as we dig deeper into the medieval mind in the next section. Now that you've had a taste of what medieval scribes were up to in their spare time, let's dig deeper into one of the key figures who helped unlock the mystery behind these bizarre battles, Lillian Randall. You see, without her, we might never have fully understood just how strange and meaningful these snail-fighting knights really were. So, let's pour a little more fuel on this curiosity fire and see where it leads us. Imagine being Lillian Randall, a scholar in the 1960s. You're flipping through some dusty old books, examining medieval manuscripts, and you come across one of those peculiar pictures a knight, in full battle gear, but instead of fighting a fearsome dragon, or even a menacing band of robbers, he's facing off against a snail. Now, if you're like most people, you'd probably laugh, close the book, and move on. But Randall didn't. She leaned in and thought, there's something to this. There has to be a reason these knights are battling snails. And Randall saw beyond the oddity of the image to a more profound connection that linked snails to some of the darkest social and political issues of the time. In fact, she went on to develop an entire theory about why these snails were there. She saw these images not just as random scribbles, but as powerful social commentary. Historians still argue whether Randall's theory is on point, but the idea she proposed was both fascinating and plausible. What did Randall discover? Well, she realised that these snail images appeared most frequently in manuscripts produced between 1290 and 1310. That's a very specific window of time. What was happening in medieval Europe during that period? The answer, of course, is a lot of political and social upheaval, especially with the Lombards. Randall traced these snail images back to a cultural stereotype that had been circulating throughout medieval Europe, which centred on the Lombards, a group of Germanic people who had invaded Italy and, at one point, had a reputation for being warriors of the highest order. But here's the kicker. After the Lombards were crushed by Charlemagne in 772, their reputation took a serious dive. Suddenly, the fierce warriors who had once held sway in Europe were viewed in a much different light. By the late 1200s, the Lombards had been reduced to pawnbrokers and money lenders, which made them widely despised in the eyes of many Europeans. That's where Randall's theory comes in. She proposed that the snails, slow and vulnerable creatures that they are, symbolise this retreat and degradation of the Lombards. The snails weren't just a joke, they were a way for scribes to mock the Lombards' fall from glory. It wasn't just about slow-moving snails, either. In the medieval imagination, snails carried their homes on their backs, retreating into their shells whenever danger came near. This, Randall suggested, was a perfect metaphor for the Lombards, who had once been feared warriors but were now seen as cowardly, retreating back into a life of pawnbroking after their defeat by Charlemagne. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Wait, you're telling me that knights in medieval manuscripts were fighting snails because they represented cowards? Yes, that's exactly what I'm telling you. The snails were not just a random creature chosen for their amusing appearance. They were deeply symbolic to medieval scribes. The snails represented the humiliating retreat of the Lombards, a group that had once been feared and respected, but was now marginalised and derided. But there's a deeper level to this story that we need to address. While Randall's theory makes a lot of sense, it's important to recognise that snails were far from the only odd creatures found in the margins of these medieval manuscripts. In fact, there were many other weird and whimsical beings, like rabbits, monkeys, and all sorts of fantastical animals. The snails weren't isolated in their bizarre nature. They were part of a much larger tradition of strange and humorous drawings that scribes peppered throughout these manuscripts. In a way, these illustrations were a form of rebellion. You see, medieval scribes didn't just labour over religious texts and historical accounts, they also had a lot of downtime to fill. And in that downtime, they let their imaginations run wild. The margins of manuscripts became a sacred space where they could express their creativity, make fun of the heavy subjects they were working on, and generally poke fun at the world around them. The snails were just one part of that humour, a humour that transcended centuries and still manages to make us chuckle today. But why snails? Why not something more terrifying, like a dragon or a monster? Why pick a creature that, for all its reputation in medieval art, is actually pretty harmless? Well, historians still argue about that. 2. Some scholars believe that snails, in their slow retreating nature, were the perfect representation of the Lombards' fall from power. Others think that the snails might have represented something more abstract, like the passage of time, the slowness of life, or even the insulation of the ruling class, who were often depicted as being aloof and untouchable, just like a snail in its shell, whatever the reason. The snails are still a fascinating element of medieval art. They were part of a much larger tradition of weird, funny, and sometimes unsettling images that scribes left behind. And let's not forget, these images weren't just about snails. We're talking about a vast array of bizarre creatures that filled the margins of medieval manuscripts, creatures that were sometimes funny, sometimes gross, and sometimes deeply political, but all of them reflected the medieval mindset in a way that was both humorous and satirical. In this way, the snails weren't just animals, they were tools of social commentary. They allowed scribes to express their dissatisfaction with the political and social systems they lived under. And they did so in a way that was both subtle and hilarious. The snails weren't just poking fun at the Lombards. They were also a way for these medieval artists to say, "Hey, we see you, we know what you've done, and we're not afraid to call it out." And in that sense, these snails were not just a funny quirk of medieval art. They were a symbol of resistance, a form of creative rebellion against the powers that be. And as we dig deeper into this, you'll begin to see how snails and other strange creatures weren't just about humour. They were also a way for scribes to express deeper truths about society, politics, and the human condition. They were tiny, harmless creatures on the surface, but underneath, they were part of a much larger, more profound commentary about the world. A commentary that would make the medieval scribes chuckle to themselves as they worked, all the while sneaking in their own private jokes and criticisms. But let's be honest, all of this is still pretty bizarre. Right, I mean, who would think that a knight would be caught up in a life or death battle with a snail? It seems too strange to be true, and yet, these illustrations didn't just appear once or twice, oh no. They appeared in over 70 different illustrations, spread across 30 different manuscripts. This wasn't some fluke, or some isolated artist's weird moment of inspiration. This was a trend, a medieval meme if you will, that kept popping up again and again. The persistence of these snail images tells us something important about medieval society. It tells us that even in the midst of all the seriousness, the strife, and the hardships of the time, there was room for humour, for satire, and for rebellion, and those little snails, well, they might have been the perfect vehicle for all of that. As ridiculous as they were, they managed to say something important about the world, and they did it in the most absurd and whimsical way possible. As we continue exploring this fascinating topic, we'll uncover more about how these snails fit into a much larger narrative about medieval life, art and culture. But for now, just remember this in the medieval world. Sometimes the best way to get your point across was to draw a knight fighting a snail. It's weird, it's funny, and it's absolutely brilliant. Now that you've been introduced to Lillian Randall's theory and the medieval knight's epic battles against snails, let's take a deeper dive into the medieval mindset itself. This wasn't just about snails. Oh no, this was about a culture that had a very unique, and often strange, relationship with art, humour, and even politics. And it wasn't just the scribes having a laugh on the side. The very act of drawing a snail in battle was loaded with meaning, commentary, and let's be real a hefty dose of sarcasm. So let's shift our focus and see what's really going on here beneath the ink. Medieval times were no stranger to absurdity. If you lived in Europe during the medieval period, you'd be surrounded by a world where the line between fantasy and reality was often thin enough to trip over. People believed in dragons, sorcery, and a whole host of supernatural beings. You probably had a hard time finding a knight who didn't think he was one sword swipe away from slaying a beast that could fly. And yet, somehow, these same knights ended up battling creatures like snails in the margins of their manuscripts. It's as if their lives were so full of strife and grandeur that even the most absurd scenarios found a place to fit. And when you consider this, the medieval mindset starts to make sense. These were people constantly fighting for survival, caught between the weight of religious dogma, endless war, and political struggle. Humour wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. The battles knights fought with snails, and the other oddball creatures that scribes drew, can be seen as outlets for stress and frustration. They were more than just comic relief, they were tiny rebellions, humorously showcasing the absurdities of the world around them. Historians still debate whether these Knight of our Snail illustrations were satirical jabs at the Lombards, but one thing's for sure, they reflected the chaotic, hyperbolic reality that people lived in during the late medieval period. And while the snails themselves were harmless, their symbolism was anything but. They were a way for scribes to lash out at the political realities of their time. The snails weren't just slow-moving creatures, they were symbols of the enemies and powers that felt too sluggish to make any real difference. They were an allegory of things that dragged on too long or didn't deserve their position of influence. And given that the Lombards were often the butt of these jokes, it becomes clear that these snails were a way to belittle the once great invaders who had been reduced to pawnbrokers and moneylenders. This wasn't just about snails either. As much as these medieval artists loved a good absurd drawing, they didn't just stop at snails. Their illustrations were teeming with strange creatures and bizarre scenarios. Some of the knights were depicted fighting rabbits, monkeys, and all sorts of odd beings. These weren't your standard medieval foes. These creatures weren't some metaphor for danger or evil. They were funny, they were unexpected, and they were a reflection of the absurdities that filled the scribes' lives. Think about it, the scribes of the time had been tasked with copying religious texts, legal documents, and historical accounts over and over. They were chained to the same monotonous task day in and day out. But the margins were their escape. It's where they could draw, scribble, and let loose. And, let's face it, no one's feeling very rebellious when they're knee-deep in transcribing a sermon or copying down 100 pages of law. But when you add a knight fighting a snail into the margins, well, now you've got a story. You've got humour, you've got a little bit of freedom in a world where that wasn't always possible. So, as we start to understand more about the world of the medieval scribe, we begin to realise that these snails weren't just a joke, they were a reflection of everything that was bizarre, absurd, and out of control in medieval life, in a world ruled by kings and popes, where knights fought wars and peasants struggled to survive. A snail was a perfect way to poke fun at the system. It wasn't just a random drawing, it was a sneaky little bit of defiance tucked into the corner of a page. Now, let's take a closer look at how these knights were depicted for most of us. The image of a knight is one of bravery and chivalry, armour-clad warriors, swords raised, charging into battle against evil. But when you look closely at the illuminated manuscripts, you see a different side of the knight. These weren't just noble crusaders. Sometimes they were fumbling fools in the midst of some utterly ridiculous battle against creatures like rabbits or snails. It's almost as if the scribes were reminding the world that, Yes, knights were heroes, but they were also human, and sometimes even heroes have to fight a snail. And that's not all. The historical context of these snail images is even more interesting when you consider the cultural and political climate of medieval Europe. The period during which these illustrations appeared was one of deep social change. There were battles for power, the rise of new monarchies, and a rapidly changing economy. The knights, who had once been revered as the epitome of warrior virtue, were now becoming something else entirely. They were caught between the old feudal system and the rising power of money and commerce. As power shifted, so did the perception of the knight's role in society. But the absurdity of these illustrations isn't just confined to the snails. Consider this, there were also drawings of knights battling winged rabbits, monks, and even bizarre creatures that were part bird, part fish, and part human. These weren't just fantastical doodles, they were commentary on the political and religious upheavals of the time. Historians still argue whether these battles reflected real-world struggles or whether they were purely satirical. But one thing is clear, they weren't just about knights in shining armour, they were about the fragility and absurdity of the medieval world. The relationship between art and humour in medieval manuscripts is particularly fascinating because it demonstrates just how deeply scribes and artists were embedded in the political, social, and religious fabric of their time. These knights fighting snails were more than just funny pictures. They were symbols of resistance and rebellion. They were drawings that said, "You think you've got it all figured out, but look at what's really going on underneath the surface." And who better to make these comments than the knights themselves, those who are often caught between the political and religious elite, battling for power, recognition, and the approval of the ruling class. But let's not get lost in the weeds just yet. These snails weren't just a random bit of medieval humour. They were a reflection of something much bigger, a period of transition and uncertainty. The medieval world was a place where power dynamics were constantly shifting, and the knight, once the epitome of strength and virtue, was now caught in a world of change. And what better way to capture that than with a battle between a knight and a snail? It's the ultimate paradox. The slow, seemingly harmless creature is taking on the knight, the symbol of speed, strength and chivalry. The snail, the very embodiment of everything that's slow and sluggish in the world, is forcing the knight into a fight for survival. At the end of the day, the medieval scribes weren't just telling stories, they were making comments about the world around them. They were using humour and absurdity to cope with the chaos and confusion of their time. And that, my friend, is what makes these illustrations so powerful. It wasn't just about a knight fighting a snail. It was about society itself, the strange, unpredictable world that these people lived in. It was a world of power struggles, religious conflict, and endless war. And in that world, the snails didn't just survive, they thrived. So, as we continue to unravel the mystery of these knight versus snail illustrations, remember this: these drawings weren't just funny, they were a reflection of a world that was just as bizarre, unpredictable, and strange as the creatures scribes chose to illustrate in the margins. The snails, in all their slow, slippery glory, were a symbol of the absurdity of life in medieval times. And the knights, well, they were just trying to figure it out one snail at a time at this point. You're probably wondering how the snails in the margins of illuminated manuscripts became such a pivotal metaphor for the medieval era. I mean, sure, the idea of knights fighting snails is funny, it's absurd, it's bizarre, but to really get to the heart of it, we need to peel back the layers of medieval society itself. Because, when you think about it, these seemingly trivial illustrations say something profound about the way the medieval mind functioned and the way it responded to power, failure, and absurdity. Now, Let's take a step back and consider the larger context. You might already know that the medieval world wasn't exactly a place for comfortable living. The centuries between the fall of Rome and the dawn of the Renaissance were marked by plague, famine, and endless wars, plenty of things that could make anyone a little, shall we say, slap happy. Life was grim, violent, and often downright absurd, but it wasn't just the peasants suffering. The nobility, too, faced their own unique set of challenges, and that's where the snails come in. They weren't just a joke, they were a reflection of the frustrations and contradictions of medieval life. Let's begin with the power structure itself. Knights, those legendary figures of chivalry and honour, were simultaneously revered and marginalised. On the one hand, knights were often seen as the protectors of the realm, the noble warriors who fought for kings, queens, and sometimes even religious causes. They were the ones who marched off to crusades, fought in bloody battles, and returned home covered in glory, or in some cases, tragedy. But on the other hand, knights were increasingly caught between two worlds, the world of the traditional feudal system and the emerging world of commerce, banking and growing urban centres. Think about it, a knight, by his very nature, was a man of war, a warrior, but in a world that was increasingly turning away from medieval values in favour of more modern economic systems. The knight was being squeezed out. He was caught in a cycle of outdated traditions and new, uncomfortable realities. He fought in wars, of course, but what did he fight for? Land, sure, but that land wasn't as valuable as it once was. The same goes for titles. Wealth was shifting, and the middle class, the merchants, the bankers was rising. They didn't need knights anymore. They could buy armies, hire soldiers, and fund their own wars. And so the knight found himself fighting in an increasingly irrelevant battle, the snails in the margins. They were a way for scribes to depict this frustration. They were an illustration of powerlessness. But it wasn't just the knights who were struggling against this shift. You had the church, to an institution that, like the knight, was desperately holding on to old ways of thinking while the world around it was changing. In the Middle Ages, the church was the ultimate authority, but as Europe moved toward a more rational, humanistic outlook, the church's grip started to loosen. The church had spent centuries controlling knowledge, keeping the masses ignorant and afraid, and regulating just about every aspect of life, from birth to death. But as time went on, people started questioning everything, including the church itself, and in that questioning, the absurdity of life began to emerge. That's where the snails come in. Think about how strange it must have felt to be part of the medieval world. You were living in a time when the ancient gods were no longer revered, but the religious authorities, now Christian, still demanded absolute obedience. You were told what to believe, how to behave, and what would happen to you after death. Everything about the medieval world was structured and rigid. So rigid, in fact, that humour was one of the only ways people could vent their frustrations. They couldn't exactly tell the king or the pope, "Hey, this doesn't make sense." But they could draw a knight fighting a snail in the margins of a manuscript. This was an outlet, a way of giving voice to the contradictions and absurdities of their time. Historians still argue about what these illustrations really meant. Some suggest that the snails were a way to mock the invading Lombards Germanic people who had been defeated by Charlemagne in the 8th century, then reduced to pawnbrokers and moneylenders. In this view, the snails represented the Lombards' sluggish retreat from power, much like a snail retreats into its shell. Others suggest that the snails represented the broader social and economic shifts that were occurring at the time. The rise of towns and cities, the growing importance of commerce, and the decline of the traditional feudal system all contributed to a sense of instability and confusion. For the knights, it was as if they were fighting something far more elusive than any enemy, something that seemed to slide and slither just beyond their reach. These knights fighting snails weren't just being mocked, though they were also embodying the very real struggles of medieval life. These drawings weren't just absurd for the sake of absurdity. They were mirrors, reflections of the frustration, the confusion, and the impotence that people felt in their day-to-day lives. And in some ways, this was incredibly relatable. You don't have to be a knight fighting a snail to understand what it feels like to be caught in a system that doesn't seem to make sense anymore. Life changes, power shifts, and sometimes you're left wondering what your role even is. Are you the hero, or are you just the guy who's been saddled with fighting something that's slow, unassuming, and completely out of your control? And the snails themselves, they were more than just silly creatures in medieval culture. Snails had an additional layer of symbolism. They were often associated with the idea of retreat, of withdrawal. A knight could battle a snail in the margins, but could he win? Could he ever truly defeat something? So, slow snails were not just literal creatures. They were allegories for obstacles that seemed both easy to overlook and impossible to overcome. They represented challenges that took their time to wear you down, much like the frustrations people felt about their leaders, their society, and their uncertain futures. What's even more interesting is the idea of time itself, and how it played into these snails. The snails were not just slow, they were, in a way, endless. They were perpetual. Time, too, was one of the key battles for the medieval people. Life expectancy was low. The plague was always lurking, and death was never far away. And yet, the people still found a way to cope. The snails, with their slow, unhurried pace, might have been a reminder of time's relentless march forward. It wasn't going to stop for you, knight, or for anyone else. The only way to fight time was to laugh at it, to mock it, to draw it in the margins, and hope you could escape from it for just a moment. The frustration that comes with fighting something so small and insignificant, yet so impossible to defeat, is at the core of these medieval illustrations. The snails weren't just slow-moving pests. They were the embodiments of the futility of life. The snails were you, trying to make sense of a world that didn't make sense. They were the fight against the inevitable, and the battle against something that would keep coming back no matter how many times you tried to stop it. And yet, in all of this chaos, there's something incredibly human about the whole affair. You could say that the snails weren't just enemies to the knights, they were enemies to the very idea of order. The world the scribes lived in was full of disorder, from the fall of great empires to the rise of new ones. The snails, in their absurdity, were a reflection of the world's unpredictability. The knights may have been trying to restore order, but the snails were reminders that chaos would always be a part of life. You can almost picture these knights fighting their slow, slippery foes, each swing of their sword landing with little effect. The snails might retreat into their shells, only to come back again, ever patient. And the knights, they kept fighting, kept drawing their battles in the margins, never quite winning, but never giving up. Maybe that's the real lesson in all of this, in a world full of things you can't control. Sometimes the best you can do is laugh about it and keep fighting however ridiculous it may seem. Alright, here's where things get even more absurd. And trust me, it's a good thing you've stuck around for this. You've seen how snails were a symbol of retreat and frustration in medieval art. But the truth is, they weren't just slow-moving metaphors for a world gone mad. Oh no, the snails had even more to say, far more than you might have ever guessed. They weren't just the punchline in a medieval meme, they were deeply connected to the social climate of the time of, yes, these snails, these harmless garden creatures, were both symbols of shame and unexpected weapons in the medieval arsenal of satire Let's talk about medieval power for a second, shall we? We're all aware that power dynamics during the Middle Ages were fascinatingly twisted. You had kings, knights, lords, and peasants, each locked in a complex web of feudal obligations, land disputes and inheritances. But here's the kicker knights, those paragon figures of bravery and chivalric virtue. Were also victims of a crumbling system. They were just as tangled in the chaos as the peasants they supposedly protected. The knightly code of conduct, known as chivalry, was still in full force, but it was also a set of ideals that increasingly felt like a joke. Why? Because medieval society was changing rapidly, and knights were struggling to keep up. Sure, they were warriors, but they were slowly becoming irrelevant in a world where mercenaries, emerging towns, and evolving commerce were slowly displacing them. It's like being the last VCR in a world full of streaming services. A knight could charge into battle with his sword drawn and honour shining. But at the end of the day, his land wasn't worth as much as it used to be. There were no longer vast conquests waiting to be claimed, at least. Not the same kind of conquests. Instead, they were dealing with political power struggles, economic changes, and, most importantly, an increasing reliance on trade and money. And let's be real here, no knight ever swore an oath to stockpile grain or fund a local merchant. So, when knights found themselves at the mercy of a world changing faster than they could swing a sword, they probably couldn't help but laugh at their own absurdity, hence Snails. Now, in medieval culture, humour was often a release valve for the frustrations of daily life. Things weren't going well, wars were messy, power struggles were constant, and the Black Plague had just finished up a disastrous tour of Europe. So, where did you turn when you needed a laugh? The margins of a manuscript, of course, and that's where you'd find Snails, engaged in an eternal battle with knights. It wasn't just random doodles, it was a way to process the sheer ridiculousness of being a medieval knight, trying to navigate a society that no longer needed what they were selling. So, these snails, slow, determined, and completely unkillable, were a way of mocking the very thing they were supposed to represent. Historians still argue about the true intent behind these illustrations. Were the snails a symbol of the knight's diminished importance, a representation of their slow decline in relevance? Or were they just some form of medieval roast, a way to make fun of their outdated ideals? Whatever the true answer, the snails weren't just cute, they were biting social commentary. As knights tried to hold on to their sense of purpose, they were often seen as outdated and ineffectual in the eyes of their society. That's where the snails came in reminders that knights, no matter how much armour they wore or how many wars they fought, were just as slow and hopeless as the snails they fought in these manuscripts. But here's the thing, the snails didn't just symbolise frustration, they were also a commentary on the world that was being built, you see. While knights fought these absurd, slow-moving snails, what was really happening around them was the birth of a new kind of power. Trade and commerce were booming, cities were emerging, and the middle class, those very same merchants who had no interest in fighting in wars, was rising. They didn't need knights to protect them. They had walls, weapons for hire, and plenty of money to buy their own security. The snails weren't just a passive symbol, they were a reflection of this new world order. They were slow-moving, yes, but they were unstoppable. Much like the rise of this new, economic-driven society, the knights were being replaced slowly, steadily, and inevitably by something else. And yet, here's the beauty of it. The snails didn't just signify the replacement of knights by merchants, they also told a deeper story about the inevitability of change. In the world of medieval knights, where chivalry and valour were supposed to rule, The snail was a reminder of how even the most important systems could eventually crumble under their own weight. Much like the medieval knight, the snail was forced to retreat into its shell as the world around it shifted. But here's the twist: just like the snails in those manuscripts, medieval knights weren't just helpless victims in this societal transition. They fought back. They fought back in the most absurd way possible, by trying to kill the very thing that represented their own downfall. It's a beautiful paradox, isn't it? The very thing that represents their obsolescence is also the thing they try to destroy. The snails weren't just symbols of failure, they were also the very things that made the knights realise their role in the grand scheme of things was not nearly as important as they once thought. These images of knights battling snails were a perfect representation of how society dealt with change by trying to fight it, by trying to reclaim what was lost, no matter how impossible that task was, in a way. These snails were the ultimate symbol of resistance to change, mocking not just the knightly code, but also the world that demanded knights in the first place. But there's another layer to all of this, one that gives us even more insight into why snails became such a peculiar and recurring motif. You see, snails weren't just fighting knights, they were fighting history. They were fighting the changing tides of power and social order, the same way that the knights were. And while knights might have had swords and armour to defend themselves, snails had something much slower and more effective: patience. The knights might swing their swords at the snails, but the snails would simply retreat into their shells, only to return again. It's the perfect metaphor for the slow, inevitable change of society. And that's why these snails' slow, seemingly insignificant creatures kept appearing in illuminated manuscripts over and over again. Historians are still unsure whether these snail knight battles were just a way to poke fun at the knights, or if they represented something deeper. But we can be sure of one thing: these images were a coping mechanism for a world that was increasingly difficult to navigate. Whether they were fighting snails to represent the sluggishness of their world, or whether the snails were a humorous reflection of the knight's frustration with their fading relevance. One thing is clear: the snails weren't just animals, they were symbols, reflections of a society in turmoil, and a gentle reminder that, no matter how hard you fight against it, change is always coming, slowly, persistently, and with a sense of inevitability. Alright, here we are, still in the thick of it, fighting snails, changing times, knights whose honour seems more like a punchline, and the gradual, often clumsy march of history. But stick with me, because now we're going to zoom out a bit and take a deeper look at the art that immortalised these bizarre battles, and the reasons medieval scribes spent so much of their free time drawing knights fighting snails. It's more than just a quirky thing to amuse the occasional reader. These snails, these knights, and the crazy little world of illuminated manuscripts. There's some serious historical and cultural commentary happening here. And if you thought we were done with absurdity, just wait. Medieval art, much like medieval life, was absurd, chaotic, and absolutely hilarious if you knew how to look at it. And the beauty of these illuminated manuscripts, those painstakingly handcrafted books, was that they were often packed with not just religious or historical texts, but also with little snippets of everyday life, complete with moments of absolute nonsense. You could be reading about some saint's holy life one page, and the very next page would feature a knight being smothered by a snail. That's the genius of these manuscripts. They were a space where deep religious and historical importance mingled with humour, satire, and, let's face it, ridiculousness. And that's where we come back to our snail knight battles. So let's pause for a moment and look at the broader cultural landscape. In the 12th and 13th centuries, illuminated manuscripts were becoming something of an art form. with scribes often adding their own personal touches, drawings, caricatures, and even jokes. Sure, the texts they were copying were often religious in nature or related to chivalric deeds. But these manuscripts weren't just about dutiful transcription, they were about expression. And what better way to express the absurdity of medieval life than with a snail, a symbol of frustration and retreat, battling a knight, a symbol of chivalric virtue. It's almost too perfect, isn't it? Here's the catch: medieval manuscripts weren't mass-produced, so they were expensive. Only the rich and powerful had access to these beautifully decorated works, and they were often used in religious contexts, as a way of illustrating the Bible, prayers, or teachings. But the fact that these works designed to be sacred, important, and powerful also contained these ridiculous little illustrations of knights fighting snails tells us something very important about medieval society. It wasn't just a society obsessed with war, piety, and duty. It was also a society full of people who understood that life, despite all its grand aspirations, was often absurd, and the illuminated margins were the place where that absurdity could be safely expressed. Medieval humour was dark, sometimes crude, and often self-deprecating. The snails weren't just a joke at the knight's expense, they were also a way of processing the social realities of the time. Think about it, knights. Once the glorious, larger-than-life heroes of the battlefield, were increasingly seen as out of touch and irrelevant in a world that was rapidly changing. And here, in the margins of books, these knights weren't off fighting dragons or slaying evil lords. No, they were fighting slow-moving, harmless creatures that represented everything that had become stagnant in the world. The snails were a reminder that the knights, despite all their fancy armour and pompous ideals, were just as slow and helpless in the face of the changing world. But it's not just that the snails symbolised frustration or decline. There's another level of complexity in these battles. Historians still argue over whether the snails were merely a humorous dig at knights, or if they served a deeper, more symbolic purpose in medieval culture. Some argue that the snails represented the natural world's quiet, relentless push forward, while the knights were symbols of human civilization's often desperate but futile attempt to control it. You see, knights were trained to conquer, to fight, to dominate qualities that made them essential in earlier centuries. But by the late 1200s, with the rise of towns, trade, and a more structured legal system, those same qualities were becoming less and less relevant. Meanwhile, snails, creatures that were anything but aggressive, were a fitting counterpoint to the knight's violent approach to life. Their slow, deliberate, and hard to get rid of qualities that made them an excellent metaphor for the creeping forces of change that the knights could do nothing to stop. In many ways, the snails were like the new social forces that were slowly but surely taking over. And what better way to depict this quiet, unstoppable rise of the new social order than by showing knights fighting snails? In addition to their obvious metaphorical value, the snails also served as an important vehicle for social commentary. Remember, medieval society was deeply hierarchical, and the artists who created these manuscripts were often commenting on the people and institutions they were surrounded by. By showing knights battling snails, they weren't just making a joke about outdated chivalry, they were also pointing out the absurdity of social structures that had become irrelevant. The feudal system, for all its grandeur, was on the way out. The knights, the lords, and the entire idea of nobility as we know it were crumbling under the weight of economic shifts, the rise of the middle class, and a growing sense that the old ways of doing things didn't make sense anymore. The snails, in their quiet persistence, became the perfect stand-in for the new social order. They were slow but inevitable, a force of nature that could not be easily defeated, and the knights, with all their training and bravado, were utterly powerless against them. What better way to express the frustrations of a society that had no idea how to adapt to the changes happening around them? And what better way to make fun of a group of people whose entire identity had been built around an ideal that was no longer needed? Historians still argue whether these snail knight illustrations were more than just funny doodles, or if they carried a deeper significance about the clash between old and new orders. Some suggest that they were a critique of medieval warriors' obsession with ideals of honour and combat, showing that they were as slow, futile, and out of touch as the creatures they were fighting. Others believe that these drawings were simply a way for scribes to blow off some steam, a place where they could make fun of the very system they were working for, all while remaining within the confines of their religious duties. Whatever the true intention behind these illustrations was, one thing is certain: the snails served as a lasting reminder of the fact that not all battles are won with strength or speed. Sometimes, the slow and steady approach wins the day. As we continue to explore this absurd world, we're left with a paradox: the medieval knights, once revered and admired, were now reduced to fighting snails, creatures that were, in their own right, a symbol of the inevitable rise of new societal forces. The knight's decline wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow, creeping process that took place over decades, and it's reflected perfectly in the snail knight battle that became so common in illuminated manuscripts. And just like those snails, the medieval knights were fighting a losing battle. Change was coming, whether they liked it or not, and no amount of armour or bravado could stop it. Now, let's step back for a moment and consider the true significance of these snail knight battles in the grand tapestry of medieval art and culture. You may be wondering, why the snails? Why not something more relevant? But the snails weren't just a weird quirk in illuminated manuscripts, nor were they simply an excuse for a bit of medieval slapstick humour. They were symbols that captured the crumbling edge of medieval society's worldview. These snails, slowly but surely eating away at the knights, symbolised the slow but unstoppable forces of change that were invading every corner of the world. The question we must ask now is, what did these snails represent in the broader historical and cultural context of the time? At its core, medieval society was about a firm belief in order: the church, the state, the feudal system. These were all pillars upon which society rested. But during the late Middle Ages, these structures were beginning to show signs of instability. In fact, they were slowly collapsing under the weight of societal shifts that many had no idea how to handle. The Crusades, the Black Death, the rise of the bourgeoisie. These were the events that defined the late medieval period. And as these forces gathered momentum, the established order, symbolised by the knights in their shining armour, began to look more and more out of touch. The snail was the perfect visual metaphor for this shift. You see, the knights in these illuminated manuscripts weren't just soldiers, they were embodiments of an old order. They were chivalric figures, noble, strong, and honourable, fighting for ideals that were slowly becoming irrelevant in a world that was moving at a different pace. And here, in the margins of the manuscripts, where there was room for artists to be a little more playful, the snails appeared, these slow-moving creatures, with their soft bodies and hard shells, were a natural metaphor for a way of life that was equally slow, stubborn, and ultimately doomed. The knights, once the champions of the realm, were now shown struggling against creatures that represented the unstoppable, slow-moving tide of history. But there's something even more interesting at play here. Historians still debate whether these Snail Night illustrations were a direct commentary on the night's declining relevance, or whether they were simply the work of artists who enjoyed a good laugh at the expense of the chivalric system. One theory is that the snails were a subtle jab at the knight's own inability to adapt to the changing world. After all, these warriors had been trained to fight with speed, precision, and strength, and yet, here they were, unable to defeat something as simple and slow as a snail. The snail was the perfect embodiment of everything the knights feared: slow, methodical, and sure to win in the end. But if we dig a little deeper, we realise that the snails were more than just a symbol of frustration or impotence. They were also a reflection of the social and economic changes that were shaking medieval Europe to its very core. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, feudalism was starting to break down. Towns and cities were growing, commerce was expanding, and a new class of wealthy merchants was beginning to rise. This was the dawn of the Renaissance, and it was all happening while the knights, once the rulers of the battlefield, were struggling to keep up. The snails, with their slow but relentless advance, were a visual representation of these new forces that were slowly encroaching upon the knightly class. The snails also represented something else: the growing disconnect between the nobility and the common people. The knights were increasingly seen as disconnected from the struggles of the average person. They were born into privilege, trained for combat, and expected to uphold the ideals of chivalry. But the reality was that these ideals were becoming harder and harder to maintain. The knights were becoming increasingly irrelevant in a world that was changing faster than they could adapt, and in the margins of these manuscripts, the snails were the perfect stand-in for the common people, slow, persistent, and steadily taking over the world that the knights once ruled. It's also worth noting that the snails weren't just symbols of change. They were also a representation of nature's quiet power. The knights, with all their armour and weapons, were a symbol of human civilization's attempt to control the natural world. But the snails, with their slimy, deliberate pace, were a reminder that nature always finds a way. The snails weren't trying to destroy the knights. They were just living their lives, moving slowly but surely, and in the end, it was the snails that won, just as the forces of nature always win. No matter how hard we try to fight them, the presence of snails in medieval manuscripts also provides us with a fascinating glimpse into the mindset of the medieval artist. These manuscripts were often commissioned by the wealthy and powerful, and they were created in a world where religion, politics, and culture were all deeply intertwined. And yet, in the margins of these sacred texts, where one might expect to find only the most serious and reverent illustrations, there were these absurd, whimsical images of knights fighting snails. It's as if the artists were saying, yes, we live in a world filled with religious dogma, political power, and military conquest, but we can still laugh at it all. In a way, the snails represent the medieval artist's attempt to reconcile the grand and the absurd, the sacred and the silly. And maybe that's exactly what we need in today's world, a reminder that even in the face of the most serious challenges, we can still find humour and absurdity. And let's not forget the cultural context here. The medieval period was a time of great religious devotion, but it was also a time of great social unrest. The Black Death had wiped out a significant portion of the population. The Crusades were causing religious and political upheaval, and the feudal system was beginning to crumble under the weight of the emerging bourgeoisie. In this environment, the knights, who had once been the embodiment of power and honour, were now seen as symbols of a bygone era. The snail, in its slow and persistent way, represented the forces of change that were slowly but surely eroding the old social order. So, what do we make of all this? Well, it's clear that the Snail Knight battle wasn't just a bizarre quirk of medieval art. It was a complex, multi-layered metaphor that reflected the changing times, the decline of the feudal system, and the growing disconnect between the nobility and the common people. It was a reminder that no matter how strong or powerful you are, time and change march on, and sometimes you're left fighting something as slow and inevitable as a snail. Historians may never fully agree on the exact meaning behind these strange illustrations, but one thing is certain: they provide us with a glimpse into the mind of the medieval artist, who, despite the solemnity of the texts he was copying, found a way to inject humour, satire, and social commentary into the margins, and in doing so, he created a piece of art that, centuries later, still makes us laugh and think, now that we've explored the snails as a symbol of cultural and social shifts. Let's turn our attention to another intriguing aspect of these medieval illuminations: the unexpected nature of the humour embedded in them. Yes, snails fighting knights is funny. It's a ridiculous image, to say the least. But humour in medieval art wasn't merely about creating a laugh. It was about subverting the deeply serious world of chivalric ideals and showing that even in the most sacred spaces, like illuminated manuscripts, there was room for playful commentary on the world around them. But what exactly was the medieval artist trying to say with these absurd, almost surreal portrayals of knights engaged in battle with snails? To understand this humour, we need to understand the context in which it was created. The late Middle Ages was a time of significant upheaval. You had the 100 Years' War, the Black Death, political corruption, and widespread economic hardship. On the one hand, the church and its religious dogma were still major driving forces in everyday life, demanding piety and devotion. On the other hand, this was also a time when the medieval world was beginning to slowly fragment. The old feudal order was collapsing. The rise of towns and cities was challenging traditional power structures, and new forms of government and thought were starting to emerge. The knightly class, which had once been revered as the very epitome of honour and valour, was beginning to look a little outdated. In this environment, where the ideals of chivalry seemed increasingly irrelevant and out of touch with the reality of the time, the snails in the margins offered a kind of subversive comedy. Snails, after all, are the opposite of what a knight represents. They're slow, passive, and unthreatening. They don't carry swords or shields, nor do they gallop around on horseback in shining armour. They move at a snail's pace, quite literally. And yet, here they were, depicted as the adversaries of knights, capable of causing great distress. The humour lies in this absurdity, in a world that valued speed, honour, and martial prowess. What could be more ridiculous than knights fighting creatures that don't even seem to care? But there's more to it than just absurdity for its own sake. Humour has a long tradition in art, particularly as a form of social critique. In medieval illuminations, it was often a way of poking fun at authority, both religious and secular, by placing knights, who were, essentially, the agents of order, into ridiculous scenarios. These artists were subtly critiquing the very system they represented. In this case, the snail, slow and seemingly insignificant, was an equalizer, a challenger that exposed the fragility of the knightly order. The snail, which seemed so harmless, was an embodiment of the forces of change that were slowly but surely eroding the knight's world. This was not just humour, it was a quiet rebellion. This brings us to the question of how medieval humour, especially in the form of illuminated manuscripts, served as an outlet for the frustrations of society in times of crisis when social structures are being questioned and people's lives are being disrupted. It's often humour that allows people to process the world around them. For the common folk, who lived under the oppressive rule of both the church and the feudal system, the humorous illustrations in these manuscripts offered a way of poking fun at those in power. The knights, once regarded as noble and powerful figures, were now depicted as struggling against the most trivial of enemy snails. Historians still argue over the exact reasons for these absurd snail battles. But one thing seems clear: they were a release valve for the medieval psyche. The idea of a knight being unable to defeat a snail, an opponent that isn't even trying to fight back, encapsulates the frustration felt by many during the Middle Ages. The snails, in their own peculiar way, represent the unyielding forces of nature, time, and change things that no knight, no matter how mighty, could defeat. And yet the snails, with their shells and slow movements, could still manage to make knights look silly. This was the artist's way of acknowledging that even the greatest warriors had their limits, and that sometimes the most powerful forces were the ones that couldn't be fought with a sword. Another reason for the prevalence of these snail battles in medieval illuminated manuscripts is the way they connected to broader medieval cultural values. The snail, for instance, had symbolic significance in medieval Christianity. The slow, methodical movement of the snail mirrored the idea of repentance and penance, both key concepts in Christian theology. To move slowly, carefully, and with deliberate intention was often viewed as a sign of moral fortitude and humility. But, as with many other aspects of medieval life, the artists seem to have turned this symbolism on its head. Instead of the snail symbolising piety or virtue, it became an almost comical challenger to the knight's supposed valour and nobility. Yet, beyond the humour and critique of knightly virtues, these illustrations also reflect something deeper about medieval society's relationship with its own ideals. The knight, despite his powerful armour and gallant reputation, was not invincible. He was, in many ways, a symbol of an idealised world that was slowly fading away. The snail battles, absurd as they were, served as a reminder that even the greatest of heroes had their weaknesses, and that sometimes the slow, relentless forces of nature could overpower even the most valiant of knights. The medieval world was changing, and the snails in these manuscripts were an artistic reflection of that. But if we zoom out for a moment and look at these illustrations from a broader historical perspective, we can see how they fit into a larger pattern of medieval humour and absurdity. Medieval art, particularly in the form of illuminated manuscripts, was full of playful, bizarre, and sometimes even grotesque imagery. It wasn't just the snails that made knights look foolish. There were also images of dragons, lions, and other mythical creatures being slain by knights in comically exaggerated ways. The humour in these illustrations wasn't just meant to entertain, it was also a way of poking fun at the unrealistic expectations placed on knights and other figures of authority. This kind of subversive humour, however, was not limited to the margins of medieval manuscripts. It also appeared in other forms of medieval literature, such as the famous fabliaux short, often bawdy tales that mocked the upper classes and exposed the absurdities of society. These stories, filled with exaggerated characters and situations, were another way of confronting the societal norms and expectations of the time. They were a release valve for the frustrations of a population living under strict religious and feudal rules, Just like the snail battles, the fablio were a way of saying, "We see your knights, your kings, and your priests, but we know they're just as silly as the rest of us." In fact, some scholars have argued that medieval humour was a coping mechanism in a world that was often brutal, violent, and unpredictable. When you live in a world where famine, plague, and war are regular features of life, humour can serve as a way to navigate the chaos. By laughing at the knight's battle with the snail, medieval people could temporarily distance themselves from the overwhelming and often terrifying realities of their lives. The absurdity of these illustrations allowed them to maintain some sense of control in a world that was anything but predictable. But beyond the laughter and the critique, there's also something deeply poignant about these snail knight battles. The snails, in all their slow, deliberate movements, represent the inevitability of time. The knights may fight valiantly, but in the end, they are powerless against the slow march of history. The snail represents time itself, slow, unyielding, and constantly moving forward. The knights may fight, but in the end, they are defeated by time, just as all things eventually are. And perhaps that's the most profound lesson hidden in the margins of these medieval manuscripts. The snail isn't just an opponent, it's a reminder that time waits for no one. No knight, no king, no warrior, no empire can stand against the slow, inevitable passage of time. As we reflect on the symbol of time in these illuminated manuscripts, let's turn to another fascinating element of medieval culture that these snail battles represent: the way medieval artists played with the conventions of power, authority, and the hierarchy of beings in the world of knights, the peasantry, the church, and the kings. Humour was one of the few ways that people at all levels of society could share in a universal laugh, even if it was one that mocked their betters. The depiction of knights fighting snails isn't just absurd in its imagery, it also draws attention to the fragility of the medieval system itself, where all kinds of people, from royalty to peasants, could be the subject of ridicule. Medieval Europe was a society deeply rooted in rigid class structures. At the top, you had the nobility kings, queens, and knights who were considered the defenders of faith, honour, and the land. Below them were the clergy, the landowners, and finally, the common folk, the farmers, tradesmen, and peasants. And yet, even in such a tightly controlled society, this art form humour through illuminated manuscripts offered a rare opportunity to challenge those at the top of the ladder. By portraying knights who were supposed to be strong, chivalrous, and near invincible fighting snails, these manuscripts poked fun at the very concept of knighthood. The knights were viewed as paragons of bravery and strength, the epitome of medieval valour. However, they were still human, subject to weaknesses, fatigue, and even ridicule. The snails, though tiny and slow, represented something that couldn't be vanquished by the knight's sword: time, inefficiency. The mundane these were things that no sword could slash through. By choosing to illustrate knights in combat with these defenceless creatures, the artists were making a statement about the futility of war, the absurdity of rigid class structures, and the fact that no one is invulnerable, not even the most decorated warriors of Christendom, in some ways. These miniature battles in the manuscript margins serve as a kind of subversive commentary on the medieval knightly ethos. The snail, with its humble shell, was no great threat to a warrior who wore steel armour, but it was something far more dangerous because it could reflect the deeper anxieties of the age. These little creatures might appear silly, but they were also a metaphor for the slow, creeping forces of change that were undermining the medieval social order. The fall of knights, the gradual shift away from feudalism, and the rise of centralised monarchies all played a role in the larger picture of medieval Europe. What better way to express the transition from the glorious age of chivalry to the age of bureaucratic kingships than by depicting knights, those paragons of power, fighting the most innocuous of creatures, a snail. This humour isn't just a byproduct of the artist's wit. It's a window into the anxieties of the time. The snail, again, could be seen as a representation of the unrelenting march of time itself, but it also represented the idea of something small and insignificant, gradually wearing away at something great. The image of a knight fighting a snail could be read as a metaphor for the slow erosion of knightly power. As larger political shifts took place in medieval Europe, there was a growing sense that the old ways where knights and nobles held unchallenged power were coming to an end. The snail's slow but unyielding progression mirrored the slow decay of this feudal order, and the humour of the battle became a commentary on the absurdity of trying to maintain an empire that was always, inevitably, crumbling under its own weight. This raises an interesting point about the role of humour in medieval society. It wasn't just about making people laugh. Humour in the form of illuminated manuscripts often served as a form of social critique, by using humour to mock knights and the ideals they represented. The artists were making a point about the failures of the medieval system. The church had its own sacred imagery and rules. The monarchs had their regal portraits and decrees, and the knights had their glorious battles, but in the margins. These artists could show the ridiculousness of all those systems, how they were all built on ideals that were ultimately too fragile to withstand the tests of time and change. In addition to the political and social commentary, medieval humour also reflected another key aspect of life. In the Middle Ages, the tension between the sacred and the profane. The church was the centre of medieval life, and its influence was seen in all things art, politics, education, even entertainment. Yet, even within the sacred texts of illuminated manuscripts, there was room for playful irreverence. These manuscripts were often commissioned by wealthy patrons, bishops, abbots, kings, people who were deeply tied to the church and its power structures, and yet, in the same breath, the artists responsible for creating these illuminated works often chose to insert comical, bawdy, and subversive elements into the margins. The idea of a knight battling a snail, a symbol of nature's slow, almost passive force, within the sacred confines of the manuscript was a deliberate act of defiance. It was as though the artists were saying, yes, this is a religious manuscript filled with holy stories, prayers, and devotionals, but in the end, even the sacred is subject to the absurdity of life. This melding of the sacred and the profane wasn't new to medieval art. It had roots in earlier traditions, particularly in the classical world, where gods and heroes were often depicted in humorous or even absurd ways. However, the addition of such humour into the illuminated manuscripts of the Middle Ages served a new purpose. It reflected the tension between the rigid, hierarchical structures of the church and the inevitable, uncontrollable nature of life and death. Historians still argue whether the snail battles were a form of commentary on the power of the church, or on the decline of knightly virtue. But one thing is clear, these battles weren't just about making a knight look foolish, they were about creating a space where the sacred and the absurd could coexist, in a world where the church held ultimate power, where the knight was supposed to be an unwavering symbol of strength and honour. These absurd illustrations were a quiet rebellion. They were a way for the common person who would never get the chance to speak in the royal courts or before the Pope to share in a bit of humour at the expense of those who held power. But humour, in this case, doesn't just reflect the frustrations of the common folk, it also speaks to the medieval artist's personal relationship with the divine. These artists were often monks or scribes, trained in the ways of Holy Scripture and the traditions of the Church. They were part of the system that controlled life and death, salvation and damnation. And yet, by inserting these ridiculous battles into the margins of the manuscripts, they were making a subtle point about the nature of faith itself. The Snail Knight's battle could be seen as a kind of metaphor for the human struggle to understand the divine, the knight, representing human strength and reason, struggles against an opponent that seems completely out of place, a slow-moving, insignificant creature, and yet the snail prevails. In many ways, this is the perfect metaphor for medieval life, the constant struggle between the human and the divine, the physical and the spiritual. Knights, with all their training and glory, were ultimately powerless against the slow forces of time, nature and fate. The absurdity of a knight fighting a snail was a reminder that no matter how much armour you wore, no matter how many battles you won, you were always at the mercy of forces greater than yourself. In the end, we are all powerless against the snails of life. As the medieval world turned its pages in illuminated manuscripts, there was a subtle, almost satirical moment that artists used to highlight the ways in which knights and the institutions that upheld them were slowly, inexorably becoming less and less relevant in the face of overwhelming change. And while the battles between knights and snails may have seemed utterly ridiculous on the surface, these images held far deeper meaning that extended into the realm of social commentary, political disillusionment, and a profound sense of humour. As we've discussed, snails were more than just creatures of the garden. They were metaphors, loaded with cultural significance and embedded in historical stereotypes that said as much about the medieval world as any knight's tale of heroism. And here we arrive at the issue of humour in the illuminated manuscripts. Humour was not merely a means of entertainment, it was a clever subversion of authority. After all, who else could challenge a knight's honour or a lord's power with the same level of impunity as the small, quiet snail, who never raised its voice but crept ever forward? Snails, as strange as it sounds, had become symbols for a time when those in power, whether they were royalty or knights, were growing increasingly fearful of their impending irrelevance. So, what better way to illustrate this feeling of unstoppable change than by portraying their mightiest warriors in struggle with an organism so slow, so patient, that it had already won before the battle even started. Take, for instance, the way medieval people viewed the snail's pace. The medieval world was, after all, an age obsessed with the idea of movement, spiritual, political, and physical, and the snail's tortoise-like progression became a powerful reminder of the inevitability of time. The most powerful knights were often tied to a past that was slowly slipping away from them, whether through changes in the military, the rise of centralized monarchies, or shifts in the religious and philosophical landscape of Europe. The snail, in its quiet, slow pace, was a creature that made the knight's swift and violent charges appear almost comical. The knight's most significant weapon, his speed, agility, and fortitude, was useless against the unhurried advance of the snail. As time moved on, those knights found themselves stuck, unable to adapt to the new ways of thinking that were taking hold in their world. So, when you look at these illuminated manuscripts, there is something deeply poetic and poignant in the humour of a knight battling snails. These images, though seemingly absurd, were capturing the very heart of a world that was on the brink of tremendous change. the feudal system, which had defined the lives of peasants and knights for centuries, was starting to crumble. The rise of a burgeoning middle class, the centralisation of power by kings, and the development of new trade routes were all shifting the social and political landscape. The knights, once the great defenders of Christendom, were increasingly losing their place in this changing world. In a way, these battles between knights and snails were symbolic of this slow but inevitable shift. Knights fighting something that couldn't be defeated by force, something that moved at its own pace, unaffected by the knight's chivalric ideals. Now, let's take a step back and consider the snail itself, not as the object of ridicule, but as an active player in this medieval tale. Snails, as creatures, have always been symbols of something more profound: patience, endurance, and quiet strength. In the illuminated margins of the manuscripts, these snails were not portrayed as weak or cowardly. Rather, they were shown as steady, persistent, and unmoving in the face of external pressures. The knight, on the other hand, represents the old guard, a warrior of the past, who is bound by his code of honour, his idea of chivalric strength, and his relentless drive for battle. But in the world that was evolving around him, this knight was increasingly becoming irrelevant, and that's where the snail, in its slow, deliberate motion, becomes a more potent symbol than any knight's sword. In these manuscripts, there's an irony at play. The knight, in his proud armour, struggles against the snail, but in doing so, he also embodies the futility of his own existence. The knight represents a type of idealised masculinity and strength that was slowly being eroded by the slow-moving, impervious forces of history. Think about it here. We have a knight who represents the height of medieval society's values: bravery, honour, strength, fighting something as humble as a snail. And yet, in this struggle, it's clear that the knight is doomed. He cannot win. The snail, by virtue of its unyielding, methodical pace, wins simply by being time, nature, and the inevitable march of history will always come for the knight. No matter how many battles he wins or how many dragons he slays, the snail, though seemingly insignificant, is an immovable object in this equation. Historians still argue whether these knight-snail depictions were meant to mock the very idea of knighthood, or whether they were merely a playful way to show the absurdity of certain medieval ideals. Were the snails a metaphor for the slow decay of the knight's status, or were they simply a form of harmless fun, regardless of the original intent? The illustrations serve to highlight one crucial fact: knights were no longer the towering symbols of might and glory that they once were. As monarchs consolidated power and the Renaissance ushered in new ideals of humanism and reason, knights found themselves slipping into the margins of history, quite literally, in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. The question remains, though, why the snail? Why not another creature? One with more obvious symbolic weight? Why not a lion? For example, a creature that symbolised power, nobility, and strength. The answer might lie in the way snails were viewed in the medieval world. As we've mentioned, snails were often associated with slowness and, in some contexts, cowardice. However, there's a darker side to this symbolism, one that links snails to impotence, an impotence that mirrored the slow and painful decline of the knight's power in the late Middle Ages. The knightly class was beset by many challenges: the rise of professional armies, the consolidation of royal power, and the changing nature of warfare itself. These factors contributed to the erosion of the knight's traditional role as the ultimate defender of the realm, and as the knight's power waned, so too did the idea that they were invincible. So, by choosing the snail, artists could be offering a subtle commentary on this very process of decline. The snail was the perfect metaphor for a knight who, despite his best efforts, was helpless in the face of time, change, and the inevitable forces that were reordering the medieval world. It's as if the snail, in all its simplicity, became a symbol for the knight's inability to keep up with the times. It's a bitter pill to swallow for the medieval knight, someone who had been bred to conquer, to be reduced to fighting something as seemingly insignificant as a snail. But in the face of change, the knight, no matter how valiant, had no choice but to battle on, even if his struggle was destined to be futile. And then there's the idea that these snail fights were, in part, a playful escape for the scribes who created them. After all, these artists weren't just creating work for the church or the courts. They were human beings, with senses of humour, and they found ways to insert their own frustrations, joys, and absurdities into their art. The snail, in a way, becomes a playful defiance against the seriousness of the world the knights inhabited, here in the margins. The scribes could engage in a type of rebellion that was entirely their own, mocking the very institution they served with their art. As you begin to understand the deeper layers of the Snail Knight battle, it becomes clear that this isn't just a funny little image in a manuscript. It's a symbolic war between two forces, the old ways, represented by the knight, and the slow, inevitable force of change, represented by the humble snail. This battle, small and absurd as it may seem, encapsulates the very heart of medieval society's growing anxiety. As we continue our exploration, we'll see how this small, unassuming creature, one that moves with an inexorable slowness, began to symbolize something much larger than itself. Now, imagine this: you're a knight. You fought battles, worn your armor with pride, and carried the weight of history on your shoulders. You're a product of centuries of chivalric codes and expectations. But here you are, standing face to face with a snail. Yes, a snail. You, the embodiment of medieval martial prowess, reduced to battling a creature that's known for its sluggish pace and tiny, humble existence. A tiny creature that never seems to rush. It's like trying to fight a philosophy that refuses to be proven wrong. What do? Do you fight harder? Do you call for reinforcements? Do you face the shame of your friends watching you lose to a mollusk? Of course. You would do your duty, regardless of how absurd the task seems. You would fight it, tooth and nail, figuratively, of course. And therein lies the beauty of these images. The absurdity is what gives them meaning. The knight, representing all that is brave and true in the medieval world, fights a losing battle, destined to be overwhelmed by a force he can neither escape nor conquer: time. Now, let's step back for a moment and think about why these illustrations were so widespread, especially in manuscripts produced between 1290 and 1310. This was a time of profound societal change. The feudal system, with its rigid class structures and chivalric traditions, was facing a slow but steady collapse. The rising power of monarchies, the growth of commerce, and the transformation of military tactics were all forces pushing medieval knights to the fringes of the social landscape. The knights who once fought in glorious battles against foreign invaders were now being replaced by professional soldiers and even mercenaries. So, in the margins of these illuminated manuscripts, you have knights battling snails, a symbol of something far greater: the slow, inevitable erosion of the medieval knight's place in the world. Historians still argue whether these snail illustrations were a form of satire directed at the knightly class, or if they were just simple pastimes for the scribes, who, let's face it, spent hours transcribing religious texts and might have needed a bit of light-hearted relief. But regardless of their original intent, these depictions of knights fighting snails became a representation of the tensions within medieval society. Knights, once seen as powerful protectors of the realm, were now powerless against the tide of history, in the same way that a knight could do little to stop a snail's slow but inevitable advance. So too were the medieval systems of honour, warfare, and feudalism unable to stop the sweeping changes brought about by time, economics, and political shifts. As we continue to explore this bizarre juxtaposition, consider the ways in which these snail knight images played with the concept of honour for centuries. Knights were the paragons of honour, strength, and chivalric virtues. They were the heroes of epic tales, celebrated in songs and poems, revered as the defenders of the weak and the upholders of justice. But in the margins of these manuscripts, that very honour is turned on its head. The knight, in all his armoured glory, is depicted as utterly powerless against the humble snail, which becomes the very symbol of the knight's powerlessness in an increasingly indifferent world. The snail doesn't need to be quick or mighty, it just needs to exist, slowly and relentlessly moving forward. It's a metaphor for the world itself, creeping forward, indifferent to the struggles of those who try to resist it. The knight, like the snail, is trapped in the flow of time, and there's no way out. And let's not forget about the snails themselves. They weren't just symbols of stagnation or impotence. They were also creatures of survival. They might be slow, but they were resilient. They carried their homes on their backs, retreating into their shells whenever danger approached. In many ways, snails embodied the very concept of endurance, the ability to survive against the odds, to move at your own pace, and to outlast those who are too eager to race ahead. In medieval society, where the pace of life could be unpredictable and brutal, the snail's ability to endure became a powerful metaphor. The snail wasn't concerned with rushing. It wasn't concerned with status or glory. It just existed in its own way, doing what it needed to do to survive. In contrast, knights were often bound by their codes of chivalry, their need to prove themselves in battle, and their quest for glory. But as time wore on, the knightly class became more and more entangled in ideals that didn't quite match the realities of the world around them. Their sense of honour, once tied to the land and the people they protected, was now being replaced by a more rigid, less personal form of warfare, one that valued strategy and numbers over individual bravery and combat. Knights found themselves in a world that no longer needed them in the same way. They were, like the snail, becoming relics of a past era. Of course, the snails in these manuscripts weren't just a symbol of the decline of knighthood. They were also part of a larger trend in medieval art and literature to challenge established norms, just as the troubadours and minstrels sang of love and chivalry. Subverting the idealised images of courtly romance, the artists who created these illuminated manuscripts used humour and absurdity to subvert the traditional ideals of knighthood. By depicting a knight, a figure whose purpose was traditionally to battle fearsome dragons, enemy soldiers, and other great beasts fighting a slow-moving creature like a snail, the artists were making a pointed commentary on the irrelevance of these old ideals in the face of new societal structures. There was also an undeniable element of fantasy in these images. The medieval world was one of both brutal reality and rich imagination. People could, and often did, live in a constant state of tension between the harshness of their daily lives and the fantastic worlds that existed in their stories, their art and their dreams. In these marginal illustrations, the line between reality and fantasy is blurred. The knight may represent the world of power and feudal rule, but in the world of imagination, the world of the margins, the snail is just as worthy of attention. The snail, with its slow, deliberate movement, becomes a hero in its own right, one that conquers the night with nothing but time on its side. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of these medieval depictions is the fact that they were created during a time when the concept of time itself was undergoing a shift. The medieval period was one where time was not always measured in the rigid, mechanical way that we think of today. The idea of working against the clock was foreign to most medieval people. Instead, time was marked by the changing seasons, the movement of the sun, and the rhythms of daily life. Time was slow, unyielding, and, for many, simply a matter of survival. The knight, whose life was once defined by his ability to conquer time through battle and conquest, was now in a position where time itself represented by the slow-moving. Patient Snail was the one that held the power. The knight could no longer fight against time. Instead, he found himself at its mercy. As the snail glides across the page, inch by inch, without care for the knight's armour, without concern for his noble blood, the image becomes a powerful symbol of the relentless march of history. The knight may wear the trappings of power, but the snail, in its simplicity and persistence, holds the key to the future. The knight's armour, heavy with tradition and honour, can no longer protect him from the changes that are coming. The snail, in its quiet way, has already won. Historians still debate the exact origins of the snail knight imagery. Some believe it was a direct commentary on the decline of the knightly class, while others argue that it was simply a form of comic relief, a way for artists to inject a bit of light-heartedness into the often grim task of transcribing holy texts. But no matter what the true intent was, one thing is certain: these images are not just about knights and snails. They are about the forces of change, the rise of new powers, and the gradual fading of the old. And as we continue our journey through the illuminated margins, we'll see just how deeply these snails were woven into the fabric of medieval life, symbolising more than just a battle for survival, but a battle for relevance in a world that was changing faster than anyone could keep up. As the centuries passed, illuminated manuscripts like those depicting knights and snails became relics of an era, preserved for future generations to dissect and decode their absurdity, their humour, and their strange moments of levity, served as windows into a medieval world that was both fantastical and grounded in harsh realities. But what exactly did these illustrations reveal about medieval life beyond the snails and knights? These illustrations are, in many ways, mirrors reflecting the societal structures, anxieties, and humour of the time. If we zoom in even further, the snail, an often overlooked, slow-moving creature, emerges as a surprisingly poignant symbol of something much larger. It speaks to the slow, inevitable forces of history, of societal shifts, and of the human condition itself. If you pause and think about it, there's something deeply ironic about the medieval knight's plight in these marginal illustrations. Here they are, a symbol of strength, honour, and warfare, reduced to fighting a creature with no ambition other than to survive at its own pace. It's a battle that cannot be won, and in this, we see a reflection of the medieval knight's struggle against forces far greater than himself: societal change, the rise of new forms of power, and the diminishing importance of the knightly role in an increasingly complex world. The knight may have once been a protector of the realm, a paragon of virtue, but as the centuries wore on, the knight's power waned. He couldn't keep pace with the rapid transformations happening around him, and in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, The snails stand as a reminder that, much like the night, even the most invincible of figures are ultimately subject to time and change. In fact, it's almost as if the night's fight with the snail is a metaphor for the very struggle of the knightly class itself. These knights, proud warriors of the past, are locked in a battle they cannot win. They may don their armour and raise their swords, but the snail, in its quiet, steady way, represents the forces that have already won the changing tides of history, the rise of the bourgeoisie, the weakening of feudal structures, and the advent of gunpowder and standing armies. The knight, with all his chivalric codes, is ill-equipped to face the slow but relentless march of time and progress. He may be brave, but bravery is no match for a snail's slow, determined progress. This fight between knight and snail in the margins of manuscripts also serves as a commentary on the way medieval artists saw the world around them, in the same way that these artists filled the margins of their manuscripts with fantastical doodles, jokes, and absurdities. They also saw the world as a place full of contradictions. On one hand, you had the harsh realities of medieval life plague, war, famine, and the constant struggle for survival, but on the other hand, there was a deep, almost childlike urge to create, to imagine, and to find humour in the darkest of places, in these illuminated manuscripts. The ridiculousness of a knight fighting a snail doesn't just speak to a lost sense of honour or a world gone mad. It also reveals the resilience of the human spirit to find meaning, even in the most absurd circumstances. What's fascinating about these illustrations is the way they invite us to laugh at the very concepts of nobility and honour. The knight, for all his grand ideals, is made to look foolish as he battles a creature that, in the grand scheme of things, poses no real threat. But it's this very absurdity that opens up a deeper commentary on the medieval mindset. In a world where the line between the sacred and the profane was often blurred, where knights would fight battles in the name of God, and where honour and glory were cherished above all else, these images of knights fighting snails serve as a playful subversion of the serious business of life. They remind us that even the highest ideals are susceptible to the passage of time, that even the grandest warriors must eventually face the forces that they cannot control. And perhaps, in a way, this is a message that transcends the medieval period. It speaks to all of us, regardless of time or place. Life is full of battles, some of them grand, some of them small, but in the end, we're all just trying to survive, whether it's a knight facing a snail or a modern person trying to navigate the complexities of the world. There's a universal truth here sometimes. No matter how hard we try, we can't control everything, we can't defeat time, we can't fight against progress, and sometimes all we can do is laugh at the absurdity of it all and keep going. Historians still debate the significance of these snail knight illustrations, but their enduring presence in illuminated manuscripts suggests that they were more than just whimsical distractions for bored scribes. They were a way for medieval artists to process the world around them, its conflicts, its challenges, and its inevitable changes. The snail, with its slow and steady progress, was a powerful metaphor for time itself, relentless, inevitable, and indifferent to the struggles of the night. But the humour in these images also suggests something deeply human, a refusal to take ourselves too seriously, a willingness to laugh at our own impotence in the face of larger forces. And in that laughter, there is power. The knight may have lost his battle with the snail, but in the margins of history, his story is still being told, still being laughed at, and still being remembered. As we wrap up our journey through these medieval margins, let's take one final look at the snail. It's not just a creature of the slow and steady, it's a symbol of survival, of resilience, and of the quiet persistence that shapes history. The knight may have lost the battle, but the snail, in its unassuming way, represents something far more important: the quiet, unstoppable forces that shape the world, whether we want them to or not. So, as you drift off to sleep, think about the battles you face in your own life. Sometimes, the slow and steady wins the race, and sometimes, it's not about winning at all. It's about surviving, enduring, and finding meaning in the absurdity of it all.